everybody has ideas.
That might be able to, but there's some truth to that, don't you? Augment it in some way. But wait, there's more. The drivers of human preference in the brain. Then I have ADD, and I swear to God, the things that you think about. Welcome to the Ideasicle Podcast. Yes, welcome to the podcast where we attempt to untangle the mysteries of the elusive idea. And you know what? I'm not kidding around anymore. Today, I've brought in a knight to help us. Sir Ken Robinson, PhD, is an internationally recognized leader in the development of creativity, innovation, and human resources. He's worked with governments in Europe, Asia, and the USA, with international agencies, Fortune 500 companies, and some of the world's leading cultural organizations. In 1998, he led a national commission on creativity, education, and the economy for the UK government. All Our Futures, Creativity, Culture, and Education, also known as the Robinson Report, was published to wide acclaim in 1999. He was the central figure in developing a strategy for creative and economic development as part of the peace process in Northern Ireland, working with the Ministers for Training, Education, Enterprise, and Culture. For 12 years, he was Professor of Education at the University of Warwick in the UK and is now Professor Emeritus. In 2003, he received a knighthood from Queen Elizabeth II for his services to the arts. He speaks to audiences throughout the world on the creative challenges facing business and education in the new global economies. In fact, his 2006 TED Talk is the most emailed TED Talk in history, and man, I am not surprised. His new book, a New York Times bestseller, The Element, How Finding Your Passion Changes Everything, has been translated into 20 languages already. Now, I'm going to post his TED Talks on the podcast webpage in case you haven't seen them, and for a lot of this, we're going to assume that you have. And in fact, those talks are so part of creative culture now, it's actually how my introduction to Sir Ken happened. It was the Nick Egan podcast, and it sort of happened by accident. We were both adoring fans, and now here you are. Welcome, Sir Ken.
It's a great pleasure, Will. Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, thank you very much for making the time. I really appreciate it. Now, as I said, I'm going to post the TED Talks, but can you give us a brief overview, just kind of a foundational overview of your position on education today and how it's killing creativity in your mind?
Yes, I mean, I'm always very keen to say that I never speak in criticism of teachers or of head teachers. There are... Obviously, in any profession, there are people who aren't great at what they do, and some people who shouldn't be doing it at all. But taken overall, I'm a great admirer of the teaching profession, and it's the heart, really, of the changes I'm proposing. The problem is that education is a system, and it's a system that has its roots in the 18th and 19th centuries. And it's very much like a factory model of production. It's about standardization and conformity. And although there are great schools that operate within the system and do very creative things, they often do that almost despite the dominant culture of education rather than because of it. So I think that structurally the system needs to be seriously overhauled. And the problem, I think, is in some ways getting worse by a lot of the national reform movements that you see around the world, which are emphasizing more and more a rather dry culture of standardized testing. So in almost every respect, these systems tend to inhibit creative development.
Well, even the word standardization is the antithesis to creativity, isn't it?
Well, it's always interesting this to me because this isn't an argument against standards, and it's not an argument against rigor or discipline. To be creative, you have to do something. You can't be creative in the abstract, and being creative isn't just cutting loose and going crazy. To be creative in any discipline, you have to know what you're doing. You have to really be able to be in control of it. You can't be a creative musician beyond a certain point if you can't play. You can't be a creative mathematician if you can't do the math. You can't be a creative designer if you're not in control of the materials and don't know what materials to use. So there's a delicate relationship between creative achievement and discipline and control. The problem is not standards, because we need high standards of everything. It's standardizing, as you say. It's the fact that this culture of standardized testing, there's often a very narrow emphasis on certain types of academic work. And also, a lot of these standardized tests are based on multi-choice questions, so they're very dry. It's like taking a written driving test. They don't set out to test originality or individuality. They set out to test conformity.
Right. Well, it's interesting you bring up that in order to be creative, do you need to know what you're doing? I remember talking to Nick actually about how he used a flip cam in shooting the Duran Duran video that he had just finished, and he was a little upset that there was such a democratization of all these media vehicles that pretty much anybody can pick up a flip cam and do this. I said, you know what, Nick, if you didn't know what you were doing, if you weren't a master of your trade, you wouldn't have been able to pick up that flip cam and do what you did with it. It's still about your creativity and your ability, even though all those media, all the media production vehicles have been democratized.
Oh, that's right. And, we've had paints and pigments and paper around forever, relatively speaking, in human culture, but not everybody ends up producing great works of art with them. We've had cameras around for a long time, but not everybody becomes a great photographer. We've had instruments for a long time, but not everybody becomes a great musician. I mean, the instruments and the tools and the technologies themselves are completely neutral. They don't have any opinions about anything. It's all about what an artist can do with them. And any tool in the hands of an artist is capable of producing art. And the tools that we have now obviously make available opportunities to many more people than previously would have had access to them. But they don't automatically in and of themselves help to produce great work. It's like, we've all had access to dictionaries, but not everybody produces great poetry. Yeah. It's what you do with these things that really matters. And I think what you say to Nick is absolutely right.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Now, getting back to your central theme, why do you think educational institutions are so slow to adapt when it's so obvious that the world is changing at breakneck speed otherwise?
Well, some of them do, of course. There are great schools everywhere. There are great universities. There are great colleges. My daughter went to a community college here in Los Angeles, in Santa Monica, and I think it's a really good institution. They do great work. But there's something in the nature of institutions, of course, which in themselves is inherently conservative. If you have an organization that employs, in the case of a college or a university that employs several thousand people, there are a lot of moving parts there. A lot of differences of ideology within the system. They're administratively complicated. If you have a single school that may employ far fewer people, but it's nonetheless part of a large school district with all the checks and balances and political interests that permeate education conversation these days, there are lots of actual constraints on innovation. But also I think what happens is that people have a tendency to inhibit themselves. I do think that on the whole, people who work in education have far more freedom than they seem to believe they do. There isn't anything in the Education Act that came out in this country, in the States, 10 years or so ago. There isn't anything there that tells people that they have to do the same thing every Tuesday, or they have to divide the day into 40-minute or 50-minute blocks. And yet many schools do that.
Well, to that point, if I could interrupt, let's pretend there is a sixth grade teacher listening to this podcast right now, and maybe she's at a very traditional institution, not one of the more enlightened ones, but maybe she's enlightened. What would you tell her to do starting tomorrow that can make a small but maybe important difference to the kids she's teaching? Well,
so far as children are concerned, of whatever age they are, whatever grade they're in, when the door closes in the classroom, so far as they're concerned, that's the education system. The experience they have with their individual teachers is education for them. They don't go to school in the committee rooms of our state capitol buildings. They go to school in our local schools and with the teachers that work in them. So it's a multi-layered issue. Part of what they get, part of the impression they get of education is the culture of the school itself. How the day is organized, whether they go to different teachers all the time, whether there are bells ringing, whether there are works of art on the wall, whether there are science laboratories, and if there are, whether there's anything interesting going on in them, whether they have sports programs or whether there are school plays or community programs. All those things add up to the culture of the school. But And you're right, within some school cultures, it's very difficult for individual teachers to push back and create any kind of space. But at the same time, many teachers do that, and they do take the view that no matter what's going on outside their classroom, once the door closes and the lesson begins, they have some freedom. And part of getting kids to think creatively is giving them challenges and projects to work on and knowing what questions to give them and not assuming that teaching is simply a matter of conveying information and getting them to take notes on it or giving them standardized tests or going through rote learning. I know wonderful teachers who achieve miracles in their own classrooms because they rely a lot on group work, on provocative questioning, on open-ended tasks. And properly conceived, creative teaching isn't an alternative to high standards. It's how you achieve high standards, because you can't really achieve high standards of learning if the students aren't engaged and interested and their imaginations aren't fired up. So I always encourage teachers to look at their situation objectively and ask themselves how much freedom do they really have. Of course, if the situation turns out to be, in the end, unbearable once they walk out of their classroom into the corridor, if they just feel they're in the wrong sort of school, then I always encourage people to take a deep breath and see if there isn't a better situation they can find for themselves, because it's their life too.
Well, related to that, I'm a parent of 3 kids myself, and hearing you talk and hearing your premise here, which is alarming, and it does get parents like me to question everything about their schools, which I think is a very good thing. But what can parents do with their children every day to compensate for this sort of cookie-cutter approach in the schools today?
Well, as I say, it is about looking at each situation in its own right. How many children have you got, Will?
I have 3.
Well, I was saying this today. I was at a conference for actually the National Association of Elementary School Principals. There are, I think, over 2,000 head teachers there. And I'll ask you the question I asked them, which is this. If you've got 3 children, as you do, I bet you they're completely different from each other.
Totally.
Aren't they? I mean, you would never confuse them, would you?
No.
Which one are you? I've seen you before, haven't you?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm one of 7 kids, and we're all completely different. And anybody who has children or works with children knows that what is true of adults is true of them too, which is that we're all different. I was doing a calculation recently, or actually reading some calculations. I don't know if you've ever thought of this. There's no reason why you would have done, but how many people do you think have ever lived on Earth? I'm talking about modern human beings, Homo sapiens. We turned up about 50,000 years ago as a species, but how many of us do you think there have been?
Well, considering there are about 6 billion or so right now, God, I don't know. 20 billion?
I say, well, nobody knows, so don't feel bad about this.
Okay, that's a trick question.
Yeah, I mean, nobody's been counting. They've not been going around with calculators seeking people out for the past 50,000 years. So it's all an extrapolation. But yeah, 20 billion, I had somebody recently, some event thought maybe 300 billion, and other people think 2 billion. There's a big range here. But you're right, there are about 7 billion people on Earth at the moment. Altogether, if anybody listening to this wants to Google the question and have another shot at it, what people who thought about this and have tried to figure it out tend to conclude is there have been something between 60 and 110 billion people. Now, that's a big margin. So if we go to the middle of it, it's around 80 billion on average. About 80 billion. And about 10% of those are on the Earth right now. And my point about this is that we've all been different. Every single human being is unique and different. And we're different because of our genetic backgrounds, our personal circumstances and histories, our own dispositions, the way, the friends we have and the communities we live in. We're all unique moments in history. And I believe that what parents are interested in, I have 2 kids, what I'm interested in is what their particular lives might turn out to be. How can we enable them, as far as we're able to do anything like this, but enable them to have a life that has meaning and purpose and fulfillment. And that's, I'm sure, what you want for your children, and you want them, I'm sure, to be economically independent at some point. I mean, I certainly want my kids to.
Absolutely.
And as soon as possible, quite frankly. But and that's part of what we assume will happen when we send them to school. And in many cases, we find schools that work for them, or teachers, particularly teachers in schools, who resonate with them. But all the great teachers and all the great schools know that we're all different, and that one of the fundamental principles of human life is diversity. And although there are lots of things we need to do in common and learn in common and be able to live together in common, people get fulfillment from discovering and realizing their own particular unique talents and abilities. Apart from all the other things we need to learn about the world around us, we want to learn about the world within us and who we really are and what we can become.
And this is really the central the central theme to your book, The Element, isn't it?
Yes,
the element is the meeting point between natural aptitude and personal passion, just quoting from your book.
Yes.
So that alignment pays big dividends from what I hear.
Well, I believe it does. And as you say, we use that expression. I mean, I uniquely use it. We all use it. We talk about people being in their element, or we can think about times when we said of ourselves that, I was just in my element then. And what we tend to mean by that is that we're doing something where we feel that our most relaxed, our most authentic, our most natural, that this is something that we were kind of meant to be doing. And it isn't common, I think. It's not common enough for people that they spend their lives feeling that. Very often I find people sort of just get through the week and wait for the weekend. I don't know if it's what the figure would be just now in the US, and I live here now, but I was told recently from a news report that in the UK, over the past 4 years in the United Kingdom, medications for stress, the prescriptions for them have increased by over 40%. Well, that's an appalling figure, I think. But we know anyway that many, very many people get through their lives by zoning out, not by zoning in to themselves.
Well, all of this is connected, isn't it? Because if you think about what you're talking about as it relates to education and how strict and how it's sort of a cookie cutter, maybe that's my word, I can't remember, but that the process is churning out a certain kind of intelligence, then it does seem like, I mean, for me, when I was reading your book, I was reading it as a parent, I think, more than I was as a marketer. And it occurred to me that your question, which I just love, which is, don't ask the question, how intelligent are you? Ask the question, how are you intelligent?
Yes.
I found that to be extremely liberating, not only for me personally, but also as a parent, that's the question I should be asking about my 3 very different children.
Yes, that's right. And that's my point, really, that by one of the foundations of our current system's education is a particular view of academic ability. And academic ability, I'm always very keen to say this, is very important. I used to teach in universities, so it's not that I disparage academic work, but it's not the same thing as intelligence in general. It's a very particular thing, academic ability. It's a capacity for a certain type of verbal or mathematical reasoning, a certain type of deductive reasoning. But human intelligence covers a much greater field than that. If there were nothing more to human intelligence than academic ability, most of human culture would never have happened. There'd be no music, no art, no practical science, no business, no broadcasting, no design, no architecture. And there wouldn't be anything that involved you actually doing something. And I think that's a rather bleak view of human intelligence. And it's why I'm saying I think a lot of people go through school, a lot of kids go through school feeling they're not very smart, often because they're just not interested in what's being presented to them and they don't get engaged by it. But just as often, I think it's because the forms of intellectual activity that are most venerated in education systems are so narrow and they almost naturally marginalize the greater part of most people's intellectual capacities. It would be like if we had sports programs in schools that only focused on the high jump. You know what I mean? And you'd say, well, kids, if you're not good at the high jump, well, that's fine. We do have remedial programs in baseball and basketball and in the 100 meters and swimming, but of course the really smart kids are the ones who can jump over this particular bar. Well, it's an absurd idea.
And those others are unfunded as well.
The other ones are unfunded, and then if money is short, then we cut those things out of the curriculum altogether. Well, it's a ridiculous idea. Nobody would accept that as a conception of physical capacity. But we do something very similar in our conception of intellectual capacity. And it's why I say, as you point out in the book, that the questions we ask are very important. And we have an obsession now with IQ, which is a very particular way of measuring a certain type of intellectual ability. But people will parade their IQ numbers, as if this is some Olympic badge they've been given. And my question, as you say, is not how intelligent are you? I don't think that works as a question. It's a much better question to ask, how are you intelligent? What are the things you're good at? What are things that you are less good at? What are your strengths and your weaknesses? And I think as a parent, looking at your children, looking them in the eye, knowing who they are, and bringing all that you know to bear on how you think about their education, all you know about them, I think you'll begin to reframe them. And rather than, as often happens, some kids being made to feel inadequate because they're not good at particular things at school, as soon as they begin to find out the things they are good at and they're encouraged to pursue, it's amazing how their confidence shifts and how they start to flourish.
Yeah, I can imagine. I'm going to try that. I want to, and maybe I do it naturally to a certain degree. I'm sure most parents do respond to the different personalities of their kids, but I want to try it more. Now, you talk about the diversity of intelligence. Do you think that this is, and this gets a little esoteric, but do you think this diversity of intelligence is simply a brilliant, though carbon-based force of human evolution, that we're all this different? Or could it be spiritual? I mean, you mentioned earlier that people feel that they feel like they're meant to do this, which implies that there's a higher order. Is there any of that in your calculation here, or do you think that? I mean, there's a great example in your book about a woman who became a pool player pool player, and is the cosmos looking to create more pool players? Like, would that have ever happened 200 years ago? Like, who would she be today if pool had not been invented? Do you see where I'm coming from with this?
Oh yeah. I often think that, what would Eric Clapton have been if he hadn't found the electric guitar?
Yeah.
If somebody had handed him a banjo, he'd probably be a good banjo player, by the way.
Yeah, he probably would be.
But even pre-banjos, yes, I mean, people need the opportunity, and of course they need the medium in order to very often to flourish. I talk about two sorts of creativity, about personal creativity and general creativity, and by general creativity, I mean there are skills we can all learn and be taught. It's like a grammar of creative thinking, which will enable anybody to think more productively. And I think we should teach those things in schools. But beyond that, and I think in some ways more importantly, we all have these unique talents and abilities, and they lead to all kinds of opportunities for personal creative achievement. I mean, for example, that it wouldn't matter, I think, how long I sat in a room with an electric guitar, I would never turn out to be Eric Clapton. And indeed I didn't. So if you want any proof of that proposition, there it is. And yes, the woman you talk about in the book, her name is Eva Lawrence, and she's known as the Striking Viking. She's from a small town north of Stockholm, and she walked into a pool hall one day and with her brother when she was, I think, 14, and just fell in love with the whole atmosphere of the game. She was entranced by it, and she started to play regularly and became first the local, then the national, then the regional, then the European champion, and eventually won the world championship. And she spends her life playing pool, and she says even now that if she's at the pool table, she couldn't tell you whether she'd been there for 9 hours or 20 minutes. She gets so absorbed in the process. And that's one of the ways you know that you're in your element, is that your sense of time and absorption changes. If you're doing things you love to do, and that's how I think of the element, it's about doing things you're good at that you also love. It has to be both, not just one or the other. But if you're doing something you love to do, an hour feels like 5 minutes. Whereas if you're doing things that you're not really resonating with, then 5 minutes feels like an hour very often. And I think this is something to do with spirituality. But I don't mean that in a religious sense. I mean it in the sense that in the end, life is simply, I say simply, but it is essentially energy. We're conceived and come into being as this kind of spark of energy in life, and it persists until it doesn't and we don't. Now, I don't know what happens to us afterwards. I'm no more qualified than anybody else to talk about that. But I do know that while we're here, that our spirit, by which I mean our natural, unique energy, is fundamental to how we live our lives and how we see ourselves. You know that if you do something that you feel is in tune with with who you really are, at the end of a week or a day even, you may feel physically tired and depleted, but spiritually you're uplifted. You know, your spirits are high. We use this language all the time about being good spirits or bad spirits, and we're talking about the nature of our energy, and we know that's true when you meet people. I'm sure you find it, Will. I mean, I do. If you meet people, you know, for the first time, you tune into their energy, and you kind of have an instinctual feel about whether you connect with this person or you don't. And of course, the people you really connect with become your friends because there's a reciprocity in your energies. Yes, you mentioned Nick Egan. I feel like with Nick that when I met him through my wife Terry, that he gives off an energy that I just love and reciprocate with, and he clearly feels that with our energy too, and you can sense that with people. So I mean spiritual in certainly that fundamental sense about our own vitality and presence as human beings. There's a second sense of spirituality, of course, which is about how we influence each other's energies collectively. I have a whole chapter in the book called Where's My Tribe? And that's about the need for us to find other people who, we use other words for it, don't we? Like who are on the same wavelength as we are, who are giving out the same sort of frequencies. And Jung talks about the collective unconscious, the extent to which we all contribute to the mood, the zeitgeist of our own communities or even the whole species. And I certainly believe strongly in that there are ways in which we influence each other's thoughts and feelings which go way beyond anything we could explain in an IQ test.
Right.
Whether there's some larger force, which is what people also mean when they talk often in religious terms, that is sort of extra human and paranormal. I don't feel qualified to talk about that, but I do feel strongly that within the compass of our day-to-day experience, that our spiritual energy is fundamentally important.
Well, it could be that there's never been a better time in human history to have this diversity of intelligence, because the technology today, it's essentially the long tail for spirituality, meaning that if you have a very niche thing that gets you going, that gets you inspired, there's another word that uses the word spirit. Yes. If you're feeling inspired and it's something that not many people do, it doesn't matter anymore, because the internet can bring even 10 people from around the world who have a common, passion together. Yes, that's right.
I always find this very interesting that that these technologies, the social media technologies, Facebook and Twitter and the other social media sites, do create opportunities which never existed before to connect with people no matter where they are. And I mean, for most of human history, people were only really directly in contact with people who were physically in proximity to them. Then print obviously started to affect the distribution of ideas and was fundamentally important in shaping the modern worldview. But for most of human history, people just connected with people round about them and lived very local lives. The new media, of course, have changed our sense of perspective completely. There are limits, though, to it as well. And I don't say this in any Luddite sense. I just also know that you get some power of presence from being in the room with people that you don't get no matter how high resolution your screen is if you're Skyping with people. You know, that that there is something about the energy of a community, of being physically face-to-face with people, which is qualitatively different, I think. To be in somebody's presence is different. And so I think as far as education is concerned, as we move forward, that we haven't even begun to understand or exploit the potential of these new digital media for enhancing and enriching and extending the scope of education, and in particular for making it much more personal and personalized. But no matter how good they get, I still would always see a powerful place in schools firstly for schools, but also for the kinds of activities that bring people together to work collectively and collaboratively, because that's really where a lot of creative energy gets generated.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk to you about is, the people that listen to this podcast are probably as obsessed as I am about creativity as it relates to marketing generally, but not always. What can they do, in your mind, to be more creative, to be more inspired, and come up with more and better ideas? Is there a single piece of advice you'd give them, given all that you know and you've studied?
Yes, feed your imagination, I think, is the key to this. Can I just explain that briefly?
Please.
To me, there are three key terms here when we talk about creativity. One is imagination, the second is creativity, and the third is innovation. I work a lot with businesses, and what they're mostly interested in is innovation. And my argument with them is you can't go straight to that. That the wellspring of all forms of innovation and creativity is imagination. And imagination is the unique power, I believe, that human beings have to bring into mind things that aren't present, to bring into mind things that aren't present to our senses, to step outside the immediate circumstances and to form mental conceptions. And imagination is everything, I believe. But it's not quite the same thing as creativity, because you can be imaginative all day long and never do anything. To be creative is a very practical business. You have to do something to be creative, whether it's coming up with a marketing plan, or an advertising program, or composing a symphony, or working on a theorem in chemistry. You have to do something to be creative. It's why I was saying at the very beginning of the program, the conversation, that it's about controlling materials and disciplines. And you can't be a creative builder if you don't know about stresses and strains and construction. So being creative to me is very practical, and it's about putting your imagination to work. I think of it as applied imagination. And so when people say you can't assess creativity, I just think that's based on a misunderstanding. You can, as long as you understand that you're not creative in the abstract. You're only creative doing something. So if you want to assess creativity, you have to look at what it is you're doing. And so I define creativity as the process of having original ideas that have value. Innovation, I think, I was putting good ideas into practice. It's kind of applied creativity. But the reason I stress imagination is that, I was talking about the high jump earlier and athletics, that if you wanted to be a successful athlete, you would expect that in order to do that, you would have to exercise and take care of your body pretty rigorously and thoroughly and keep it in great shape. You wouldn't say, well, look, I'm planning to go to the 2012 Olympics. I expect to win the 100 meters, but in the meantime, my plan is to sit on the sofa watching the television and drinking Budweiser. And you think, well, good luck with that. Let's hope it works out. In all probability, it will not. And it's the same thing with creativity in any field. And of course, you can be creative in athletics. Is that to be creative, you need to be drawing on a kind of continual flow of ideas and stimulation and fresh thoughts and fresh thinking. It's about having original ideas. So keeping your imagination alive is really a critical step for your creative health. And you can do that in all kinds of ways. I think, if you've never been to an opera, go to one. If you've never been to a science museum, go to one. If you go the same way to work every day, go some different way. If you've never been to a particular part of the country, go to it and see what it's like. If you always speak to the same people every day, speak to somebody else. Read, listen to things, watch, observe, and generally try and keep your imagination fed and nourished and encouraged. And I think the more we do that, the more likely it is that our habitual ways of thinking will be challenged and broken up, and new ideas will start to form. And that's the seat of creativity. And very often it's about making unusual connections. And the more you've got to connect, the more likely it is that you'll find that your creative abilities will start to evolve.
Well, that is a perfect place to end. What's next for Sir Ken Robinson?
Well, I'm actually working on a sequel as we speak to The Element, which is a response to the question I've been asked a lot since it came out, not by everybody, but often people will say to me, we love the book, but how do I find my element? Or what do I do to help my children find theirs, or the people I love and work with to find theirs? And I've been kind of brushing that aside for the past 12 months with a breezy wave of the arm, so don't worry, trust me. But I owe people an answer to that question. The Element itself was never meant as a how-to book. And the new one isn't meant to be a conventional how-to book. I don't think there's a 12-step plan to find your element. There are 12 chapters in the book, as it turns out, but I don't think that at the end of chapter 12 I can guarantee you'll be in your element, because it's a personal journey, and it's a journey I have to be prepared to make and to put some effort into. But I think and know that there are navigational tools and techniques that will be helpful on the journey, and that's what this new book is going to provide, we hope. It's called Finding Your Element, How to Live a Life of Passion and Purpose.
Well, that's great. We look forward to that. I certainly do. And, I just want to say how much I respect the work you're doing. I think it's very important. I think the planet Earth is much better off with Sir Ken in it. So keep doing what you're doing, because you're inspiring millions, or at least one, here in Boston.
Well, thank you so much. And can I just say, there's a wonderful website called The Peaceful Planet, which I work on with my brothers, as you mentioned there. You might be interested. Your listeners might be interested to take a look at that too. Okay,
and I'll put that in the show notes as well. Sir Ken, thank you very much for being on the Ideasicle Podcast. We really appreciate it, and best of luck to you, sir.
It's a great pleasure, Will. Thank you for having me on. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today on the podcast. Every podcast, I pity the next guest, because I think the one that we just interviewed was so great. And in this case, not only was he great, he was a knight. So what are we going to do? Bring on a king next? A queen? I don't know. Well, until you find out, check out Ideasicle.com for the Ideasicle blog to continue this discussion. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this podcast. Or check out our Idea Garage sale. We've got a bunch of stuff there, mostly books, but other products too that our Ideasicle experts use to propel their own creativity. And we'll be sure to put Sir Ken's books on there as well. Now, until next time, I'm your host, Will Burns. Take care.